broke the news this week that the House Foreign Affairs Chair Michael McCaul has selected Republican Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado to lead war powers talks in the lower chamber in an effort to repeal and replace several authorizations that remain on the books. As Politico reports, Buck confirmed he's handling the strategy for as many as 4 authorizations for the use of military force. And Congressman Buck joins us now. He, of course, serves on the House Judiciary and House Foreign Affairs Committees. You know, Congressman, every time this comes up, you know, there's some issues that come up, and you know where Democrats are going to be, you know where Republicans are going to be. I've got to say, in my time on the Armed Services Committee, when this issue would come up about authorization for war powers, everything got scrambled. You didn't know, you know, sometimes you'd have some really left-wing Democrats, really right-wing Republicans agreeing together for different reasons. But in this case, it does really just make common sense, doesn't it, for everybody, that we can't keep going back to these old authorizations for war and that we got to sort through it. So how are you doing that?
Well, thanks, Joe. I think this is really a constitutional issue. It is the job of Congress to declare war and to make sure we authorize the use of military force. I have reached out to the various parts of the Republican Party. There are Democrats who are working on it with us, and we will move forward. I really think this is an issue where we could get 350 votes. Now, there will be some parts of this that are going to be tricky, and basically that involves the reauthorization, making sure that we are giving President Biden the ability to move forward with the military force. But it's in a specific way, and it should have a sunset on it so that it isn't a blank check that we are giving future presidents.
Again, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Like 20 years, you have a war authorization for the Iraq War that's still around so many years later. At some point, this is really an Article 1 question. Do we believe in the Constitution that the power to declare war rests with Congress or not? And it seems to me this is, like you said, at the end of the day, it's a constitutional question.
It is, and that's really where the rub has been in the past. The executive branch wants to maintain as much of this power as possible. The congressional branch wants to make sure we're doing our job. But the really important thing to me, Joe, is when Congress says we are giving you the authority to engage in this military action, it binds Congress, at least on a moral level, to make sure that we fund appropriately and make sure that our armed services, the members in the armed services, are protected at the very best that we can. We're giving them the equipment, we're giving them the training, we're giving them a very specific message or mission.
So I know when I worked for President Obama.
You know, Jen, I'm sorry, Jen, really quickly. It also, this lines up with, the Powell Doctrine, where when you have Americans that are sent off to war, we know why they're being sent off to war. It's very specific. We understand what goals need to be achieved before they come back home. And also, as Colin Powell said, again, from what he learned in Vietnam, you have to have the support of the American people before you go off to war. And so that's what's so, again, Jen Palmieri, that's what's so important about this is Congress, obviously, closest to the people. Congress should be the ones authorizing the wars.
And I think that most American people have no idea that we're still operating under authorization of use of military force from 20 years ago. And I know when I worked for President Obama, this was an issue when if we had to take military action, we had to go back into Iraq at one point. And it was a lot of Democrats that gave the president that were concerned about the president's use. It was like Tim Kaine, Chris Murphy, Democratic senators that were concerned about Congress not stepping up to authorize this itself. Why do you think it's taken 20 years to get to this point? I mean, is this a shared problem between Congress and presidents not wanting to ask, Congress not wanting to own the responsibility? Why are we in this situation where 20 years later we're still operating under these old AUMFs?
Well, I give Chairman McCall credit for deciding that this is the time we've got to do it. We really aren't engaged in a major military conflict. We certainly have military forces around the world, but the time to make sure that we are using really the thoughtful process that we should be using, I think, is now. The reason that we haven't done it before is because if a Republican president stood up and said, I want to go into this area, Republicans would support him. Democrat president wanted to do it, Democrats would support him. So it was more of a partisan issue before. Right now, there's somewhat of a lull, and before anything heats up, it's time to give thought to this.
Yeah, it's a great idea. I'm glad you and Chairman McCall are working on this. Speaking of Chairman McCall, he's been a forceful advocate for freedom in Ukraine and pushing back against Russian aggression. I'm curious, could you give us some insight? Because we talked about the coming Ukrainian offensive, spring offensive, and right now it really seems to hit a roadblock. What can you tell us? Obviously, that's not classified. What can you tell us about the state of the war right now, and what are some of the things that you think the United States should be doing moving forward to hopefully ultimately bring this to a peaceful settlement?
Well, Joe, the answer to your second question is everything. I think America has an obligation to our NATO allies. NATO allies certainly have an obligation to Ukraine also, but this is a strategic part of the world and an area that if we had allowed Russia to continue through Ukraine, we would be in a much worse situation. So I think whatever weapons they need, whatever support we can give them, other than boots, American boots on the ground, I think is necessary to make sure Ukraine is successful. Now, I don't know how to define success. I don't know whether it's a pre-2014 border or a post-2014 border, but we need to make sure that Ukraine makes that decision, that Ukraine has the ability to do the kinds of things they need to do militarily. Russia has set up a very strong defense line, and that's really why this recent initiative has not gone as well as Ukraine had hoped. But there are certainly weapons that we can give them, train them on, and we should not be slow walking these weapons. We've got to do this in a time frame that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm just saying this personally. Thank you, Congressman, for supporting the Ukrainian people. Thank you for supporting freedom in the West and pushing back against Russian aggression. It means so much, not just for the people of Ukraine, but for the people of Poland, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, all across Central and Eastern Europe. We thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, coming up, my conversation with another member of the All-Star cast from Oppenheimer, Robert Downey Jr.